So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion being hosted by economictimes.com. Today's topic is something that perhaps we would never have thought of even 5 years ago. It has become very, very relevant today in the context, particularly of COVID. The topic is economic nationalism here to stay? And we have an excellent panel with us. So without any further ado, let me quickly introduce them and then we can plunge straight into the discussion. We have with us Samiran Chakraborty, Chief Economist, Citigroup India; Siddharth Tiwari, Chief Representative, BIS Asia and the Pacific; Professor Devashish Mitra, Professor of Economics at the Maxwell School, Syracuse University; and Saugata Bhattacharya, Chief Economist, Axis Bank. Welcome to the discussion, all four of you. So, COVID has been described as a watershed event, and there's no denying that it's once a century event. It is a very defining moment in human history. But in the pre-COVID days, at least in the pre-Trump days, the buzzword really was globalization. Perhaps the very opposite of what we're trying to discuss today, economic nationalism. So let me start, to set things in context. Let me start by asking each of our panelists in turn, how would you define economic nationalism? And let me start with you, Samiran.
Thanks, Maithili. Thanks for having me on the show. I think there are different ways to look at the concept of economic nationalism, but let me first take a step back and talk about what is economic globalization. The economic globalization has a trade parameter to it, a financial assets parameter to it, but you can even extend it to human movements as well. And I would try to argue that this concept of deglobalization, which has led to this economic nationalism, has actually started somewhere in the 2007-8 period and cannot be directly attributed to the Trump period. It started much before that. And if you look at even some simple measures like imports plus exports to GDP ratio, or if you look at financial sector integration through global cross-border assets, you would see those curves, they peak out around that 2007-8 period. And after that, it has been on a consistent decline. In fact, even the growth elasticity of trade or trade elasticity of growth, whichever way you look at it, they have also been declining from that time. And economic nationalism followed this trend with a little bit of a lag. In a sense that people took a little time to understand what is really going on. But what is also interesting is that the other aspect, which is the human movement aspect, whether it is migration, which doubled in the last 20 years to now almost 3% of world population, or if you look at cross-border travel, we are now talking about 1.2 billion people traveling pre-COVID, obviously, which is like almost 15-16% of world population. Those kind of things have not yet peaked. And I would also argue that the key component is that while goods trade is declining, is it possible to get services trade increase substantially? And particularly in the post-COVID world, that could be a way of getting back our globalization concept, while economic nationalism remains a dominant theme in the goods trade context. But let me stop here because I'm sure my co-panelists will have different versions to share as well, and I want to hear from them as well.
Yeah, in fact, I hope they do have different views, because it's interesting to have a variety of views. So Siddharth, let me come to you. Would you agree with Samiran that actually economic nationalism started much before Trump, and we blame maybe the poor man, quote unquote, for many things that he's not entirely responsible for? And Samiran also spoke about, services. But services ultimately involves human beings. And though you can do a lot of services offshore, you do need movement of humans. And that's something that collides very severely with economic nationalism. The West may be very happy with a lot of other things that we can send from India, but they're not particularly happy to have Indians go across. So would you agree with Samiran and Siddharth that economic nationalism on those two issues, A, that it started much before Trump, and B, that the West, particularly the advanced countries, are not happy with all aspects of economic nationalism? Capital fine, but not labor.
So I think what happens is that when societies embrace a global order that is fair, that benefits every layer in society, countries are better off. Economic nationalism, the most extreme form is autarky. And I think that debate has been settled long time back, that no country, especially the country imposing it, is going to be better off. For this to succeed, the country has to be able to articulate the final destination. It has to be able to implement a transition to that destination, how the population embraces it and the benefits from the global order. And I think where nationalism starts is when society, government, businesses, as they embrace it, they're not able to support those who are negatively affected. And when that begins to increase, economic nationalism begins to take hold. It's not so much that it is nationalism, but it's a reaction to the effects of globalization, and it's a reaction to the public sector not being prepared for it. On the services, one thing that COVID has taught us is that the economies have been digitalized way beyond what was planned. And many of the services could be delivered through the digital economy. In COVID, the sector that took the biggest hit was the services sector. Essentially, the SMEs, whether they were in hotels, restaurants, other services, not all of them will rebound back the same way, but that trade is possible through a digital economy.
Devashish, I'm sure all of us agree with Siddharth when he said that autarky is not possible and nobody would argue for autarky. But even when we talk about nation states, and I think nation states are here to stay, is it possible to merge economic identities, as in the case of the European Union, for instance, while still retaining separate political identities?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about nationalism is economic nationalism is that people try to blame foreigners for problems at home, right? If you think about trade or you think about immigration, even with trade, those are goods produced by foreigners. So, so indirectly you are kind of attacking foreigners. Now, Samiran talked about economic nationalism being, we've had economic nationalism in the past, but the form of economic nationalism changes over time, right? So, for example, what we have is, a lot of the economic nationalism that you see now is also kind of happening in the presence of economic conservatism, in the sense that, low income taxes, low corporate taxes, at the same time, low social spending, right? And Siddharth mentioned that, it's because, with trade, trade creates winners and losers at the same time. And when you cannot compensate the losers, that's when you have this backlash and you get economic nationalism. But in many countries, especially the US, there aren't enough social protection. So if you look at countries like Canada or Germany, where they have a welfare state, a strong welfare state and social protection, you're not seeing that kind of economic nationalism as you're seeing, for example, in the US, at least during Trump's term. So the form changes over time, but we've had economic nationalism in the past. That it's like you get a period of relatively, not fully free trade, but it's trade is relatively free, and then there is a backlash. You go into some kind of economic nationalism. Then you see that it's not working because along with many economic nationalists believe that you can just increase exports while trying to control imports, but that doesn't happen because you need imported inputs for your exports. And if you have tariffs, so what you're basically doing is that you are increasing the demand for domestic resources from the import competing sectors, so exporters face high input costs as a result, both through the demand mechanism within the economy, and also because imported inputs are expensive. So exports suffer as a result. Or you could have countries retaliating. For example, in the US case, you had China imposing tariffs on the US. It retaliated, and China was very clever. What it was doing was it was putting high tariffs on farm products like pork and soybeans and so on, and soy products coming from the US, and and they were targeting some of the swing states to really hurt Trump politically. So in the end, the US, the Trump administration wanted a trade deal with China. So you get these, it can only work temporarily. Then you go to freer trade, and then again, if you don't have the right kind of social protection, again, you go back to nationalism. So you get this, back and forth.
Yeah, you're right on that, Devashish. Everything in the world is temporary, fortunately. In fact, as they say, change is the only constant, however cliche that may sound. Now, let me just turn to Saugata and
But in
ask.
the long run, we are all dead.
Absolutely. The question is that we have to live until they're dead, right? So let me now turn to Saugata and ask him a question. The question that I can ask only Saugata and Samiran. Saugata, would you say that the government's Atmanirbhar program as it stands right now, is that an example of economic nationalism?
So to answer your question, yes, in short. But let me step back one bit in the sense what Samiran and my other co-panelists said. My sense of economic nationalism is basically globalization meets technology. So initially, remember, I mean, with the US facilitating China's entry into the WTO, etc. I mean, this generated a wave of benefits for all everywhere. I mean, all over the world. I mean, prices dropped, things became more affordable. A huge range of relatively high quality, low cost things began to become available, and that was a very welcome move. But gradually, I mean, over a period of time, and this happened gradually. Over a period of time, people began to realize that there was an exodus of jobs in relatively protected economies out into the other developed China primarily, but other, I mean, ASEAN and the other economies. That's when the pinch began. Then over the last decade, maybe not even that, maybe even later, then with the advent of automation, technology, digital services, etc., so all of that, actual jobs began to be lost. That's when this process actually began. I mean, when this predates Trump, but that's the sequence of moves. Coming to India, I think some of the key characteristics of nationalism, of economic nationalism, were typically, I mean, the importance of state intervention over market mechanisms, etc. Focus on manufacturing, the quality of inputs, the process of inputs, and that, to my mind, definitely suggests is very redolent of what we hear of Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Okay, so Samiran, would you agree with Saugata that Atmanirbhar is a variant of economic nationalism? It's our own Indian way of putting it, because if you talk about import duties that Devashish spoke about raising, a very integral part of Atmanirbhar, though the government doesn't say so openly, is raising import duties on some items. And also the PLI scheme, the productivity linked incentive scheme, is definitely part of economic nationalism. Samiran, would you agree?
So Maitri, I'll put it in two parts. So first part is that we are, as you rightly said, that we have an Indian way of doing things. So we have this mixed version of economic nationalism, where we are tactically doing import protectionism, but at the same time keeping the capital account as open as possible. Now, this is very different from the pre-1990s economic nationalism, where we had both our trade account and the capital account both closed. And this is a very interesting experiment that we are doing. I don't know whether we are doing it consciously or not, but this, along with the fiscal subsidy part that Saugata was talking about, that's a very unique combination of economic nationalism. But my second point is that not only are we doing it this way, there seems to be a thought process that to get into a globalized trade, the right preconditions are not yet in place in India. So in other words, we need to get our productivity significantly higher before we can think of competing with rest of the world. And we know the background of this, that a lot of these FTAs that we had signed, those FTAs did not work in our favor. So it appears that there is a rethink on just getting slam bang on globalization without getting our house in order. So both this mixed version of economic nationalism, as well as first setting the house in order, whether it is this infrastructure investment or other kind of labor reforms, everything that the government is pushing through now is just to get that productivity up there so that we are in a position to compete on an equal footing with the rest of the world. I think these are the two prongs of the Atmanirbhar strategy that I find to be very interesting.
Oh yes, in fact, in the land of Buddha, I think India always believes in path, following the middle path, as it were. But Siddharth, Samiran also talked about FDAs. So between that, the complete globalization, when the whole world was going rah-rah about globalization and all the rest of it, and as you mentioned, autarky, which is a complete no-no, are FTAs, free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, something like a middle path, which perhaps India could follow? We didn't know how to negotiate our FTAs well, perhaps, which is why we have not really benefited. But could FTAs and RTAs be the way forward?
Always FTAs and RTAs provide a structure for countries to move forward. And I think here that the crux is how we reform and strengthen the multilateral rules to make them fair, to make them inclusive, and to the extent possible, less swayed by political cycles. And in this, as they are implemented for each country, to look at people at the middle and the bottom. Are they benefiting or not? Because the rest will benefit. And I think at this juncture, especially, there is an immense potential to tap into the benefits from the advent of technology, a place where India is pretty far along in terms of being able to tap into it, whether it is e-commerce, fintech, and doing this without creating a digital divide between nations and within a nation between different sectors. So that's something that is possible. It's beneficial for India. And there are global institutions there that design and share best practices, set these rules, provide assurance to investors. So in some ways, it has to go hand in hand. It has to go with embracing a system that's fair, articulating to the own population where the country is going, and putting in place the safety nets that take care of the people who are negatively affected. I think it's the last part that is always challenging, and it's all around skill development. It is all around skill development. And in many countries, for example, the US, at times, education budgets come out of property taxes. In a crisis, people lose jobs, their properties go under, property values fall, education budgets fall. Just at the time when you need to reskill the population and put an impulse into reskilling higher education budgets, there's a retraction. So I think things like this are critical at the micro level to ensure that skills are maintained as this transition takes place.
Devashish, Siddharth reaffirmed his faith in multilateral organization, understandably so since he's from BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, which is an outstanding example of multilateral cooperation. But given what we've seen, the kind of backseats that multilateralism has taken, particularly under the Trump administration, with the US virtually out of WTO, though not formally, and definitely formally out of climate change, the Paris Pact, etc. Though Biden has reaffirmed that the US is going to be very much joining the climate pact again, is it really correct to say that FTAs and RTAs would be a via media? Because the fact is that even in an FTA, ultimately the stronger economic power always wins, which is what we saw with all the trade pacts that the US renegotiated. And multilateralism, the WTO being an outstanding example of how chaotic it can be. Democracy is chaotic, so are all multilateral organizations. And if you talk of the IMF and the World Bank, they're really not multilateral in that sense. The US and the European nations certainly have a veto power. So are FTAs and RTAs a way to go, or is it the best we can hope for in an imperfect world?
When India started liberalizing, it was unilateral liberalization in 1991. India did unilateral tariff reductions, and we've seen benefits from that for a couple of decades. You went from under 4% to 6%, and then for a period of 8% growth. But right now, I think it is the time for joining FTAs. Precisely because any kind of further liberalization would require exchange of market access, and a multilateral approach is not very effective now, given that the WTO has failed as an international organization in bringing about the successful completion of any kind of trade round. The Doha round has failed. The only thing that came out of it is the trade facilitation agreement, and India had problems with that. India actually kind of stalled the trade facilitation agreement for a while, and then there was some disagreement over MSP and all that. But right now, the problem I see with FTAs is, when you do an FTA with a developed country, they try to impose their standards, their environmental standards, their labor standards, and that's kind of a problem for India. Now, in the case of the RCEP, it was different. But then, China was involved, and there was fear that, Chinese imports from China would just kill Indian manufacturing. So it's a hard problem to solve. But, the only way you can solve this problem is bringing about some other kinds of reforms, like labor reforms, reforms in land acquisition and so on. Unless Indian manufacturing becomes competitive, and it's not competitive because you have stringent labor regulations, and there have been some moves. The government has made some good moves in that direction, but a lot more needs to be done. So without these domestic reforms, other kinds of complementary reforms, I don't know how India could bring about further reforms. But these, tariff hikes that we've seen in the last 3, 4, 5 years are not very helpful, because, input costs are being raised. So you think about textiles, this artificial, the tariffs on artificial fibers are so high. India has the ability to produce good quality cloth, but the inputs are expensive. The same holds for a lot of automobile parts, and as well as the tariffs on automobiles, which has made the Indian automobile sector highly inefficient. So, but FTAs, but with some domestic reforms. Otherwise, India is never going to sign these FTAs, because there's going to be so much pressure from inside. You know, the political economy is not right for any kind of further reforms, but, you know, reversing the old reforms that we've seen in the last 5 years is not very helpful.
Saugata, would you agree that between FTAs and the WTO wins hands down? Because for a country like India, our strength lies in negotiating in a multilateral forum rather than with any other advanced country whose economic clout is far more than us. That is now my first question to you. So FTAs versus WTO, what would you favor? Number one, however skilled we are in negotiating. And Devashish made a comment that the 1991 reform, the lowering of import duties, was done unilaterally. Now, is that a romanticized view of what we did? Or is it that we did it because the gun was held, if not literally, even virtually to our heads, because we had no money at all? We had to go basically pledge our gold, and the IMF was breathing down our neck. So 2 questions to you, Saugata.
Let me start with the first, with the WTO versus the FTAs. Unfortunately, I really don't know how, with the new US administration coming in, how the WTO framework will move forward from here. But my own inherent sense is that the WTO probably will not be as powerful a framework going forward. It will be the regional trade bodies, the FTAs, RTAs that you talk about. Whether it be the ASEAN, whether it be the North American, whatever, European and different. So my sense is putting our eggs into the WTO basket will probably yield diminishing returns going forward. Second, I agree with Professor Mitra and the other panelists that while it's one thing to try to make sure that our inherent productivity, internal productivity increases and we give ourselves some respite by putting on some import duties, I think it's very, very important to understand that competition is the key to productivity. So of course, I mean, you have to figure out on the input markets, the labor costs, etc. But while we are trying to temporarily, while we are trying to shield ourselves, insulate ourselves from foreign competition, probably unfair foreign competition, we have to make absolutely sure that internal competition is very, very robust and active. In this context, I mean, we can move in different directions. In this context, India seems to have succeeded in one, leapfrogging in technology. So, I mean, our digitization, etc., technology is now completely rampant across the country. I mean, in the smaller cities as well. Second, we seem to have built up a fairly robust entrepreneur ecosystem, and entrepreneurship, a culture of entrepreneurship, together with the finance, with the PE, VC, other funding. As Samiran mentioned, we need access to global capital pools. So we have to make sure that we are internationalized in terms of finance. But we seem to have built up a domestic, robust domestic entrepreneurial ecosystem, and with the availability of technology. So we have to make sure that we do not miss out on this bus. I'm not completely convinced. Yes, manufacturing will improve, and we have already seen many instances in multiple sectors, and the PLI will obviously impact on this. But this the fintech, technology, entrepreneurship, startup system, that has to provide robust competition and then probably partnership as well with the larger companies. Without this internal competition, I don't think we are going anywhere. Together with this, the role of the state is to make sure that the operating conditions, I mean, the ease of doing business, structural reforms, etc., make us more and more competitive with each passing day. But that competition aspect, whether it be internal, till the time that we get external competition, I think that needs to be.
Absolutely, Saugata. However ironic it might sound, yes, COVID did have some silver lining as far as India is concerned, because the pace of digitization has grown by leaps and bounds, something that was completely unimaginable before COVID hit us. So however ironic it seems, every plus, minus, I think nothing in the world is black or white. They're all different shades of gray. But Samiran, if I could turn to you right now and ask you, is this kind of movement from globalization to economic nationalism, if we see it as a swing from one extreme to another, is it partly because the benefits of globalization were overdone? The entire idea that global supply chains were here to stay, is it history now? Is it irreversible? Because it also assumes that everybody plays by the same rules. Whereas if we've seen, certainly in the case of China, if I can mention one particular country, however, I know incorrect it might seem politically, not every country plays by the same rules. So are global supply chains here to stay, or is it that India doesn't need to worry because global supply chains are soon going to become history? Samiran.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and there are a lot of academic studies which are now getting deep into it. That, in fact, we have also done our own work in Citi on this issue about trying to understand the limits of benefits from supply chains. And this is very sector specific also. So in certain sectors, almost 10, 12 years back, you could find that the supply chain benefits have almost peaked out. And after that, as the benefits started dipping off, the incentive to get into more complex supply chains, that has come down. On top of it, I think COVID has posed a very serious question about how much you can trust your supply chains. And in fact, to extend that point further, people are also questioning that is it better to have a just-in-time inventory sort of thing locally, which will give you better benefit, or you should have a what normally is nowadays called a China plus one model, that you have at least one more supply chain somewhere else. My sense is that this is not yet a settled debate. Everyone is trying their own versions, and they're trying to see which one will work. And I'm not sure that supply chains are completely gone, but an associated point is that how is, say, an issue of income inequality getting resolved by supply chains or not? So your standard Stolper-Samuelson theorem would argue that in a less developed country, if you have supply chains being there, then income inequality will actually improve there because the labor there will benefit from that trade. And that's how the income of labor will go up. But the flip side of that is that as soon as the wages start moving up, the benefits of the supply chain will start coming down. So then you have another location where wage costs are lower. But very soon you are going to exhaust these places where you have both the technological capability to do the production as well as you have cheap labor. And the moment that happens, then for certain products, the supply chain becomes unviable or less productive, and you start looking at a different model. So I think this is what the world is struggling with right now, that once China is gone, would India be able to offer that huge opportunity of a China plus one model where everything else is there? It's just that last mile, if we can kick in, then maybe the new supply chain could happen through India. But I must say that after COVID, all this is being re-looked at by every company, that what would be the best mode of doing things going forward.
Yes, that's now that COVID is done. We've all gone back to the drawing board. But Siddharth, we will ask you the same question that basically I asked Samiran. You know, India's one of the biggest regrets really was that we were not on the global supply chains. We felt we'd missed the boat. But when COVID happened and we realized our critical dependence on China for ingredients, as far as pharma was concerned, pharmaceutical companies were drugs were concerned, we realized how important it was to have our own entire supply chain from start to finish. And we had that advantage as far as PPI, as in masks were concerned, because when COVID hit us, we had virtually no production of masks and PPIs. But suddenly we found that we were able within a month or two to do both those things. So supply chains versus not being self-sufficient, how much integration is good, how much of it is bad? Should we aim for complete integration or integration along with self-sufficiency? What is your view, Siddharth?
So I'll answer it in two bits. What Samiran said is exactly right, that just-in-time production models took a hit, and some element of just-in-case production models will remain with us for a long period of time. And that's the insurance each country needs to have. And when I said initially that when you integrate into a global economy, you need to have the safety nets in place, where if the spigot is turned off, that there's still the ability to participate and deliver. But looking ahead, like if we look ahead from now, I think all the work that has been done in embracing digitalization argues for a public-private partnership, where the public sector lays the guardrails down, the regulations down, and provides comfort in terms of implementing that model in terms of financial stability, and the private sector innovates on that. I'll give you an example. There's some work done that showed that the whole Aadhaar UPI set up in India, the way it was done with the public sector providing the foundational rails, enabled India to leapfrog about 50 years relative to what would have happened otherwise. So you see a system in terms of identification, in terms of payments, that's 24/7, 365, costless, instant settling inside the central bank. That is big tech friendly. There's no longer a debate here whether regulation collides with technology. And India has an example here that needs to be scaled up.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I said even the worst crisis does bring some kind of blessings. But Devashish, as the only academic on the panel, what is the view in academia about global supply chains? Are they here to stay or are they not? Or can we have some kind of system where you can be partially integrated but yet not fully integrated? 100% dependence versus 0% dependence, somewhere in between. How does one hit that wonderful via media, Devashish?
So in academia, the people who do research and trade, they believe that global value chains are here to stay, except that China might have a smaller role. It'll still have a bigger role, but they might, some of the buyers here might look for suppliers and they've already started looking for suppliers in Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia, because China is a big country. These are much smaller countries. So even for them to together actually replace China is going to be difficult. Now, India can, in India has this opportunity to fill some of this void, but India is not really a low-cost nation by any means. Of the kinds of labor regulations, because land is difficult to acquire and those kinds of things, and India doesn't have like real economic zones like Shenzhen. Those are the things that India will have to do to actually jump into these value chains, because you have you have SEZs. The biggest ones are like 50 square kilometers or something, which is like nothing compared to Shenzhen type, autonomous economic zones. But one thing that could happen is that the value chains could become more domestic and through greater automation. I mean, automation was automation was increasing, but the speed of this increase will probably go up due to due to COVID, due to rising wages in China, and it's going to make more automation more profitable now. So I think what we'll get out of this is some movement away from China, but global value chains will be there, and also some automation. I mean, increased automation. And automation, people argue, is will be helpful because in the case of a pandemic, you limit human interaction. So if you have automation, the economy doesn't have to shut down as much as in the case where there is no automation, because it's human contact that has to be restricted during a pandemic. Robots can keep working, right? So so that's basically the kinds of ideas people are talking about.
Oh, yes. In fact, as I said, the entire idea of economic nationalism really has come to the forefront, partly because of COVID. But since we're in the midst of a cricketing season here in India, let me end because we just have about 5 minutes left into the session. So let me end by throwing a small little googly at all of you. Samiran, if you look at the kind of cooperation, the kind of globalized cooperation we saw on vaccine development, that's an outstanding development. All this talk of economic nationalism is really overdone. But then we have the recent controversy over the EU not allowing export of vaccines. And that shows that economic nationalism, however you define economic nationalism in the context of the EU, is still very much there. So how does one resolve these two issues? Cooperation when necessary, at the same time when the push comes to shove, economic nationalism once again to the forefront. Samiran.
I think one of our panelists in the beginning only highlighted this, that ultimately, I think it was Professor Mitra, that ultimately, if the benefits are not percolating to the common man, then there will always be objection to any sort of economic cooperation. I don't think any political leader in any country or any European Union anywhere would be benevolent enough to do solve a game theoretic problem where it's good for world welfare that we do better cooperation. Everybody is going to be somewhat myopic in thinking that it should benefit that country and particularly the common man in that country. So ultimately, I think the test of globalization is going to be if it can demonstrate that a strategy of cooperation actually benefits the common man in every part of the world. And it works in a perfect pendulum sort of a way that at certain points of time, the problems from autarky become so acute that you go towards globalization, and then the problems of globalization, you face up to it and think that maybe we should move into the other extreme. So I don't think it's like a flip of a switch that you can suddenly convince people that at this point of time is better to go towards globalization versus better to go towards economic nationalism. You have to give it time. I mean, we are in that phase right now where we are in that flux where we are neither in one extreme towards economic nationalism nor in one extreme towards globalization, somewhere in the middle.
I agree. It's not something that you put on and put off with a flick of a button. But Siddharth, if you see what happened with Brexit, clearly there are moments in time when people feel that, yes, we've had enough of globalization. We want to be on our own. So what is your take on economic nationalization versus globalization in today's context?
So in today's context, I think the two major challenges ahead of us are both in the global commons, and economic nationalism will not solve it, cannot solve it, will not solve it, is pandemics and climate change. And no country can do it alone. Setting out fair rules by which nations cooperate, allow for a transition through the two biggest challenges in front of us right now is the only way forward. No one country can do it. And I think if we don't get over the hump on these two issues, there will be significant financial damage. Whether a country cooperates or not, doesn't matter, it's going to be hit. So I don't think it's a either or choice, there is no choice. Some structure needs to be agreed on where everyone participates. And as Samiran said, it has to be fair. It's got to be seen to be fair. It needs to pass the smell test, and each country needs to take care of people who are going to be adversely affected.
You're entirely right on that. I wish I could agree with you more. But Devashish, Siddharth mentioned two interesting things, both about climate change as well as pandemics. And this is not the last pandemic we're going to see. But the fact is, both Samiran and Siddharth also use the word fair. Now, how does one define fair? What is fair to one person might be grossly unfair to another person. And if we've seen with multilateral organizations, it's impossible to arrive at any kind of agreement. So what is the way forward, Devashish?
So in the context of the pandemic, if you are trying to control the pandemic at home in your home country, it's just not enough, because if there are other countries which are not going to get the vaccines, it's going to, at some point in time, the disease is going to travel back, or in future, if you have a pandemic in the future, you won't, you need that global cooperation also, because you need information from different parts of the world to actually prevent pandemics. So I think this I think the COVID pandemic actually underscores the need for global cooperation. Um, because if you had more global cooperation, you wouldn't be having shortage of PPEs and things like that, or and as I said, you need information to flow from one part of the world to another. But the pandemic has also opened up other kinds of opportunities for a more global world, in the sense that, for example, I find that teaching and seminars by Zoom are very effective. So there is skill building, education is something that a lot of countries need, and this basically education could become much more global, and that global education could be a lot cheaper. Uh, so online education could actually be something that could flourish in a post-pandemic world, because we've actually enhanced our online skills quite a bit. I never thought I could actually teach classes online, and now I can teach it as well as in person. Um, but the other thing is about things like research, for example, medical research. There needs to be some kind of cooperation. Otherwise you're going to see a lot of resources being put into things that other countries have already discovered. And so there are a lot of things, there are different ways in which global cooperation can expand as a result of pandemic. But you talked about this issue of fairness. So you cannot prevent pandemics by just trying to focus on your own country, right? So even for your own benefit, you need to help other countries. And I think Germany has been thinking of helping poorer countries get vaccines. And I'm sure more and more developed countries will think along those lines, because it's in their self-interest. So fairness applies in a domestic context, but the moment you think in international terms, fairness is a very vague concept, because you don't care about it's a beggar thy neighbor approach that kind of dominates everything, right?
Yes, and
So
hopefully global leaders will realize that. But we're coming to the end of our discussion. Saugata, I'll give you the last word. Where would you place economic nationalism, globalization? Has the pendulum swung from one extreme to the other? And are we somewhere near coming to a via media? Saugata.
No, absolutely. I think we are all looking at an appropriate equilibrium. There's no doubt about it, because I mean, there are way too many externalities now in the way that we function, the way we live, the way our economic activities intertwine together, to be able to swing either way in a complete autarky or complete total laissez-faire. None of these will work. So we are all looking to see what kind of equilibrium stability we get. Finally, let me end with this. There are so many issues of equity that all my fellow panelists have highlighted. One thing I need to mention is that we need to create an ecosystem that creates jobs. That's the ultimate source of equity that will come about in the system. I mean, and whatever we do, I mean, whichever equilibrium we finally gravitate towards, that has to be an employment creating equilibrium. And so really, I mean, with each passing day, it's becoming more and more difficult, but that's the political economy that will need to be managed.
Okay, that's a good way to end. In fact, Saugata used a favorite word of all economists, equilibrium. But what economists often forget to mention is that very often they talk of equilibrium in the context of ceteris paribus, everything else remaining unchanged. Unfortunately, in today's world, nothing remains unchanged. But on that happy note, that things are not as bad as they seem to be, and the world is realizing the importance of working together, and more importantly, living with each other and in a more equitable fashion. Let me thank my wonderful panel for this extremely interesting discussion that we had. All four of you, Saugata, Samiran, Siddharth, and Devashish, thank you very much for making this a very, very interesting and exhilarating, I would say, conversation. Thank you so much.